Video games have been a massive part of some of our lives for a very long time. From the ColecoVision to the PS5, at-home video game entertainment has gone through a lot of changes over the years. From graphics that blew people's minds away in the 80s, that now we view as archaic, to the modern-day rendering of games with realistic facial movement, weapon and character modeling, animations, etc. With the years that video games have been around, so has people who oppose them. From our parents telling us that our brains would melt if we sat too close to the TV playing, to today's subject, becoming violent because of violent video games. The reason I decided to do this video is because I watched a news clip recently of Marcus Evans, an Illinois state representative, who is trying to pass a bill in Illinois that will ban all purchase of violent video games in the state. His reasoning? Grand Theft Auto V. Yes, a game that was released in 2013 is now the primary cause of a rise in carjackings in Chicago. The number of carjackings was higher in 2020 than it had been in prior years, so blaming a game that came out 8 years ago for a specific city's crime is clearly the cause of that, and banning it the only solution. This isn't the first time we've seen government officials attempting to ban video games. Frankly, the ESRB rating system in North America is largely thanks to the US Supreme Court, who, in 1993, deemed that the game Doom was too violent for younger audiences. I won't argue that logic. But does that prevent younger kids from playing these types of games? Absolutely not. But it leaves the decision of purchasing a game that is rated 18 plus for a younger individual up to the parents of said younger individual. The idea that video games make people violent is a tough one to say the least. I don't personally agree with it. I've played violent video games my whole life, and not once have I stolen a car or a plane, committed assault or murder, nor have the many friends that play these video games as well. Yet, there are studies on the subject, but do they hold any merit? Looking at the different studies will give you inconclusive evidence for both arguments. Keep in mind, these studies are from the US and are therefore a measure of their population. With that said, though, there are a lot of different cases where mass shootings have taken place and the gunman will, in desperation, say that video games caused the incident to happen. A prime example of this is the shooting that took place in El Paso, Texas in August of 2019. The gunman had made a reference to video game soldiers while telling police about why he had committed the crime, trying to lead investigators to think that video games were to blame. Though his true motive behind the shooting was actually ethnically driven, stating in a note that the crime was because of the Mexican invasion of Texas, clearly reaching for some plea at insanity or something of the sort. Another big case was in 2011, where California tried the exact same thing as Illinois. The bill to pass was to ban all forms of violent video games from purchase or rental. Apparently, that was supposed to keep violence down. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled against the bill, stating that its wording was vague and ill-defined and violated First Amendment rights for entertainment merchants. Within this case, video games were brought up that showed extreme violence, i.e., excessive murder, decapitation, the use of all sorts of implements to murder, severing of body parts, etc. Also stating that ethnic cleansing games existed as well. The problem with those games, the cleansing ones, is that they were made by white supremacist groups targeting their own people or like-minded people and were never for sale through any reputable merchant, online or otherwise, making it a hard argument for California to hold up. The late Justice Antonio Scalia, who presided over this hearing, pointed out some issues with the studies, stating that they show, at best, some correlation between exposure to violent entertainment and minuscule real-world effects, such as children feeling more aggressive or making louder noises in the few minutes after playing a violent video game than after playing a non-violent video game. Even the American Medical Association has stepped in on this subject to do studies on mental health and video game links, but yet again, the studies were at least internally divided. Sure, someone with a mental health disorder that causes hallucinations or periods of non-lucid consciousness may cause some violence that has been seen in video games, but the margin is so low that it can't be really equated to video games as a whole. The National Center for Health Research also chimed in on this with an article that I think sums up the different studies and their variety of conclusions fairly well. Very few studies have looked at whether playing violent video games increases the chance of later delinquency, criminal behavior, or lethal violence. Such studies are difficult to conduct and require very large numbers of children. It makes sense that since playing violent video games tends to increase the level of aggressive behavior, it would also result in more lethal violence or other criminal behaviors, but there is no clear evidence to support that assumption. So, with the argument of violent video games creating violent people still being up in the air as far as experts are concerned, do most people, including gamers, agree with that sentiment? Absolutely not. It seems that this argument and the studies that are thrown out there are a distraction from the real causes of violence and crime that exist within the US, that haven't been looked at properly or just largely ignored. Many legislators and representatives will make a big fuss about video games as a scapegoat for real problems, giving the public a supposed sufficient culprit to the rise in crime, and after the decision gets thrown out in court, everyone settles down and no more is brought up on the subject until the next big crime that video games need to take the fall for. Sure, here in the Great White North, we have our violence and our crimes. It happens everywhere, unfortunately. Yet we really haven't had this argument in a court setting here. Sure, parents and groups have opposed this with some articles written, but it's never been to the Canadian Supreme Court. With the same case in 2011 rippling its way up north, media decided to interview a Canadian law firm that deals primarily with entertainment laws and stated that the laws in Canada are adequate enough throughout the provinces to prevent the sale of violent video games to children, adding that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, similar to the Constitution, for the American viewers, guarantees the right of freedom of expression to all Canadians, including video game developers, meaning that the ESRB is good enough for us. Yes, buying a video game in Canada can be a bit of a pain. ID has to be provided if the individual is under the 18-year-old requirement, but for us up here in Canada, that's more than sufficient. It just seems to me that every few years a video game gets brought into the news in the States, with Grand Theft Auto in this case multiple times at this point, to attempt to correlate crimes and violence with video games. Yes, this was a thing even in the 90s, as was pointed out. Another organization will come into play and attempt to argue either for or against and end up with inconclusive answers with absolutely no evidence to back either of their allegations. And the cycle repeats itself until either video games are banned or solid evidence is given to the people to support the fact that video games don't cause violence. Either way, video games are a place to escape reality, to enter into a virtual story and become a part of it, like reading a book. You find yourself in a place that you can immerse yourself. Violent video games are a part of that, just as much as games that are non-violent. Call of Duty, Battlefield, and other first-person shooters throw you into a combat zone as a soldier where the fear of death doesn't exist. Does that mean that people think in real combat that they would just respawn? Of course not. That's ludicrous. The same thing goes for games like Grand Theft Auto. I can steal a car and run over pedestrians and have shootouts with police, or steal a jet from a military base and grief other players online without the repercussions of anything happening to myself, the pedestrians, police, and their families, because it's just a game. Does that mean I think I could get away with doing that in the real world? Of course not. The argument of do video games make you violent is the exact same as saying, does watching Harry Potter make you a wizard, or does watching Die Hard make you a cop? The answer to these questions are the exact same. Of course not. That is just ridiculous.